Everyone laughed when she bought 90 skinny sheep, until they found water underground. Sarah Miller wasn't the type of woman who waited for anyone's approval to act. Raised on a property with dry land and the smell of burnt grass, she learned early on that life in the countryside wasn't generous with those who hesitated. But neither the years of hard work, nor the mornings waking up before the sun, nor the winters that cracked the ground like old porcelain had prepared her for what she was about to do on that noisy livestock auction afternoon, in a shed full of ranchers who knew her by name but didn't take her seriously. It was when the auctioneer announced the lot no one wanted that Sarah raised her hand firmly without hesitating and bid on 90 skinny, scrawny sheep with dirty wool and bones showing under thin skin. The silence lasted less than 2 seconds. Then it turned into open, unceremonious laughter. "She bought trouble," said one of the ranchers out loud without bothering to lower his voice. "Threw money in the trash," confirmed another, shaking his head with that mix of pity and satisfaction of someone who thinks they have more sense than their neighbor. From the back of the shed, leaning against the rusty iron fence, Mr. Howard Sterling and his wife, Mrs. Eleanor, exchanged a look that said everything without needing words. Howard, a man with broad shoulders and a deep voice who usually spoke as if he were doing a favor, tilted his face toward his wife and just muttered, "She's lost her mind for good." Sarah heard it. She was far enough away that they thought it hadn't reached her ears, but she had heard every syllable. She smiled sideways, signed the paper the auctioneer's assistant handed her, and left with her 90 animals without looking back. Only she knew what she had used to pay for that lot, and only she knew why. The property where Sarah lived with her husband Thomas and their 2 daughters was a little over 6 kilometers from the edge of the small town of Hope Junction, a little town stuck in an eternal standoff between the past that stubbornly refused to leave and the future that never arrived in a hurry. The land the family occupied had been Sarah's grandfather's, then passed to her father, and finally to her, the only one of the 3 children who stayed. The 2 brothers left early, one for work in the big city, the other simply faded from the news over time. Sarah stayed because she couldn't imagine her life anywhere else but that red, dry land that smelled of damp dust after the scarce rain. Thomas had come to the property years ago as a hired hand to help with the harvest during a tough period, and ended up staying because of Sarah, who at that time was 23 and had a way of looking that left men without a ready answer. They got married on a simple weekend without a big party, just the closest family and the usual neighbors. 2 years later, Emily was born, the oldest, and 2 years after that came Molly, the youngest. Life hadn't been abundant, but it had been theirs. Every fixed fence, every spice planted in the garden, every small progress made with calloused hands had the taste of something truly earned. But the drought that had taken over the region in recent years had changed the pace of everything. The pasture dried up before its time, the price of bought hay rose non-stop, and the few animals the family raised were sold one by one to make ends meet. When Sarah arrived at the auction that afternoon, the family's savings account had a balance that would barely cover the following month's expenses. She used practically all of it to pay for the 90 sheep. Thomas didn't know. When she got home with the transport company's truck unloading the animals into the old corral, he was fixing the back gate and stopped what he was doing to look. He counted the animals with his eyes, slowly, trying to understand what he was seeing. "Where did these sheep come from?" he asked, still holding the tool in his hand. "From the livestock auction," Sarah answered without drama. "Bought with what?" She didn't answer right away. She opened the corral gate to let the animals in, and only then turned to her husband. "With our savings." Thomas stood still for a time that felt longer than it really was. The afternoon sun hit the side of his face, marking the lines around the eyes that years of outdoor work had dug in. He didn't shout. He didn't slam the gate. He just stepped down from the gate's rail, leaned the tool against the fence, and went into the house without saying another word. That silence weighed more than any argument. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to hit like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Sarah spent that first night at the corral until later than necessary. It wasn't just to see how the animals adapted to the new space, though she was watching that too. It was because inside the house the air was too heavy to breathe, without feeling the weight of her husband's disapproval in every corner. The daughters had eaten dinner quietly, sensing something was wrong between their parents, and went to bed without the usual bedtime chat ritual. Sitting on a log near the corral, Sarah looked at the animals with a mix of worry and certainty that she herself found hard to explain out loud. The sheep were indeed in a pitiful state. Their ribs showed through the sparse wool like sticks bent under thin cloth. Their trembling legs gave away weeks of poor feeding. 2 of them could barely stand without leaning their flanks against the fence. Any experienced rancher looking at that lot would have come to the same conclusion as the men at the shed. That was a loss for sure. But Sarah hadn't bought the animals for their condition. She had bought them for the memory of a grandfather with big hands and a gentle voice who had taught her when she was 7 that a sick animal doesn't lie. That a weak creature, without energy to seek shade out of habit or water out of routine, acts on the purest instinct there is. And that instinct, when observed patiently, reveals what the human eye can't reach. Grandpa Arthur had walked with her across the property one afternoon in a light drizzle decades ago, with bare feet in the red mud, until they reached the south corner of the land. There he had stopped. He pressed his foot into the ground slowly, as if listening to something the earth was telling only him. Then he bent down, picked up a handful of clay and kneaded it between his fingers. "See the color," he said to little Sarah. "Darker, cooler. Feel it?" She had put her hand on the ground as he instructed. The earth there was different, denser, cooler. "What's here, Grandpa?" "Water," he answered, with the seriousness of someone who doesn't say such things lightly. "A lot of water deep down. One day someone will have the courage to look for it." Grandpa hadn't had that courage in his lifetime. He died a few years later, without ever drilling that spot. Sarah's father hadn't even taken the matter seriously when she, still a girl, repeated the old man's words. "Your grandpa was full of stories," he had said, laughing tenderly but not believing her. Sarah grew up carrying that memory like someone keeping a letter that hasn't yet come time to open. When the drought hardened and the bills started weighing heavier than the rains, she began thinking about that childhood afternoon with a frequency she could no longer ignore. And when she saw, on the cooperative's bulletin board, the auction with that lot of 90 skinny sheep no one wanted, she felt something she couldn't call anything other than recognition. As if the right piece had finally appeared at the right moment. What she needed were animals that acted on pure instinct, with no formed habits, no routines that tied them to a known path. Animals that, when let loose on strange land, would seek what their bodies knew they needed. Animals that would lead her to the place her grandfather had found decades before. She knew it sounded like an absurd gamble to any sensible person, and that was precisely why she hadn't told anyone, not even her husband. In the days that followed, Thomas moved around the house and the property with a silence that Sarah knew well. It wasn't the silence of someone who had given up arguing. It was the silence of someone processing something too painful to turn into conversation just yet. He did his daily chores, ate at the table, answered when his daughters spoke to him, but when his eyes met Sarah's, there was a wall there that she had helped build. Emily, the older daughter, was 14 and had a sharpness that sometimes scared her. One morning, while helping her mother sort the laundry, she asked bluntly, "Mom, are we going to have to sell the land?" Sarah stopped what she was doing and looked at her daughter. "Why do you ask that?" "Because Mrs. Eleanor went to school yesterday to talk to the cafeteria lady. I was passing through the hallway and heard her say it would be a shame when we had to leave here." Sarah felt her jaw tighten, but she controlled herself so as not to show the anger rising in her chest. "Mrs. Eleanor doesn't know what she's talking about," she said with a calm that cost her. "But is it true, Mom? Are we going to lose the land?" "Not as long as I have breath left," Sarah replied, and she went back to sorting the clothes with a firmness in her hands that left her daughter silent. But the conversation echoed inside her for the rest of the day. Mrs. Eleanor had gone to her daughter's school. That wasn't a coincidence. That was calculated pressure, the way the Sterling couple had always operated, not with direct confrontation, but by infiltrating the spaces that hurt the most. At the children's school, in the comment that reaches the right ear at the right time, in the gossip that becomes truth before it's even verified. The couple, Howard and Eleanor Sterling, had tried to buy Sarah's property 3 times in the last 5 years. The first time right after her father died and she was left alone with the inheritance. The second, when Thomas had lost part of his income during a period of illness and they were tighter. The third 6 months ago, when the drought had hit its hardest peak and they sent a written offer with a value that was an insult disguised as generosity. Sarah had refused all 3 times, but the couple had never stopped trying. They simply changed their strategy with each refusal, like someone who has all the time in the world and the certainty that sooner or later the other person will give in. What they wanted with the land, Sarah suspected, but didn't know for sure. The property had nothing apparently special. It was dry, the pasture thin, the subsoil seemingly as hard as any other land in the region. But there was something in that persistence that went beyond simple greed for property. Howard was too smart to want land without potential. He knew something, or suspected something. That suspicion had come to Sarah like a bolt of lightning one afternoon when she was walking along the property line and saw Howard standing on the other side of the fence, not looking at the house, not looking at the pasture, but looking at the ground. With that manner of someone evaluating something that wasn't yet his, but he already considered his own. She had stored that image without knowing exactly what to do with it. Until that afternoon at the livestock auction, when the pieces began to fall into place. In the first 5 days with the sheep on the property, Sarah established a routine that no one around could understand. She would wake before dawn, when the sky was still a dark leaden color, promising light without yet delivering it, and go to the corral to release the herd into the field. Then, instead of going back to the house, she would stay. Sitting on a rock or leaning against the fence, with a small worn notebook in her lap, she would watch, not to see if the sheep were eating well, if their wool was improving, if there were signs of recovery in their physical condition. She watched where they went. At first, the animals moved without clear direction, exploring the new space with that caution of creatures that haven't yet memorized the territory. But by the 3rd day, Sarah began to notice a pattern she wasn't willing to dismiss as chance. During the hottest hours, between 10 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon, most of the herd would start moving toward the same spot. Not all at once, not in an organized way, but in small groups that would arrive and linger in the same place, like finding a resting spot the others already knew. The southern corner of the property, exactly where Grandpa Arthur had stopped decades before with his bare foot in the mud. The first time she clearly noticed this, Sarah stood still in the middle of the field for a few minutes, unable to move. Her heart was racing in a way she couldn't control. She took a deep breath. She walked to the spot where the sheep were clustering, gently pushed some animals aside, knelt on the ground, and pressed her palm against the dry earth. The difference was subtle, but it was there. A coolness that couldn't be explained by the sun beating down on that spot since morning. A different density in the soil that resisted slightly differently under the pressure of her hand. She stayed on her knees there for a long time, with the sheep moving around her without fear, and felt something she couldn't quite name, but that felt very much like the sensation that a path she had started walking decades ago was finally leading somewhere. Thomas found her like that, kneeling in the field alone among the animals when he went to refill the old water trough. He stopped at a distance, stood watching for a few seconds. Then he left without asking anything, and that silence carried more weight than any question would have. That night, after the girls had gone to sleep, Thomas sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that grew cold, untouched, and Sarah realized the time had come when the silence would need to become conversation, whether she wanted it or not. "Can you explain to me," he said, in a voice that held no anger, only weariness, "what exactly you expect to happen with 96 sheep on dry land?" Sarah sat on the other side of the table. She thought about telling him everything, her grandfather, the memory, the pattern she had observed over 5 days, the strange coolness of the soil in the southern corner, but as she pieced the words together in her head, she realized it would sound exactly like what it was, a gamble on a childhood memory and animal behavior against all the logic of an experienced rancher. "I'm watching something," she said at last. "What? Where they go?" Thomas looked at her for a long moment. "Sarah, we don't have money for more than 2 months. The girls need school supplies next month. The shed roof is giving way again, and you're sitting in the field watching where the sheep go." "I know." "You know," he repeated, unable to hide his disbelief. "And that's all you have to say?" "For now, yes." He got up, poured the coffee down the sink, and went to bed without another word. Sarah stayed alone in the kitchen with the light on for over an hour, the little notebook open on the table in front of her, the observations from 5 days written in small, steady handwriting. She ran her finger along the lines, reviewing each record, looking for holes in what she had observed. She found none. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and, especially, subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot since we're just starting out. Now, continuing. The following week, the situation between her and Thomas worsened in a way she hadn't foreseen. It wasn't a big fight, not a shouting match that the daughters could hear from their room. It was something worse, the arrival of a formal purchase offer for the property, delivered by a man Sarah didn't know, who came walking down the dirt road on a heavy afternoon sun and said he was representing an interested party in the property. The paper, folded in 3, bore an amount that was an insult, written in fancy handwriting. Sarah read it, folded it back, put it in her pants pocket, and dismissed the man with enough politeness not to show anger, but with enough firmness that he wouldn't need to come back. But the damage was done because Thomas had seen the man arrive, had seen the paper handed over, and when Sarah came into the house without saying a word, he stopped what he was doing and asked, "Was it from Howard?" "Yes." "How much?" She told him the amount. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "That amount would let us start over somewhere else," he said, with a caution in his voice that showed he'd thought about it more than once. Sarah slowly turned her face toward him. "I'm not selling this land," she said. Simple, no drama. "Sarah, I'm not selling. This might be the last time I say it, Thomas, but it'll still be my answer." He walked out of the house and stayed outside for a long time. She didn't go after him. There was a line she had decided not to cross, and that included defending a position that only she still believed in. 2 days later, Thomas grabbed a small backpack with some clothes and said he was going to spend a few days at his older brother's place, who lived 30 kilometers away. He said he needed air, that he was suffocating there. He didn't say he was leaving forever, but he also didn't say when he'd be back. Emily saw her father leave with the backpack and went to her mother with teary eyes, still in her school uniform, which she'd arrived home in an hour earlier. "Did Dad leave?" "He went to visit your uncle," Sarah said, with a calm that cost more than anything else had that week. "Because of the sheep?" "Because of a lot of things, sweetie. But is he coming back?" Sarah looked at her daughter, 14 years old, and those big eyes she got from her father, dark and deep. "He's coming back," she said, and she believed it was true. But the nights that followed were long in a way she wasn't used to. The bed too big, the house too quiet, her 2 daughters sleeping in the next room, while she lay awake reviewing every decision she had made in the past weeks, asking herself if she had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. What got her out of bed in the morning, those days, wasn't the certainty that she had done the right thing. It was the impossibility of backing down. She had gambled the family's savings, her husband's trust, her daughter's peace of mind, and the opinion of the entire community on the memory of an old man walking barefoot in the mud. If she was wrong, the consequence wasn't just hers. It was everyone's who depended on her. But if she was right, on the 12th morning with the flock on the property, while Molly was still asleep and Emily was packing her backpack for school, Sarah went to the field before the sun had fully risen and stood still watching. The sheep were already moving across the field with more energy than in the first few days, the feeding with the little bit of feed she had gotten on credit at the town market having some effect, though they were still far from healthy. And when the sun really started to heat up, she once again observed the movement she had recorded so many times in her little notebook. The animals, in small groups and without any coordination among themselves, slowly drifted toward the southern corner. Some stopped halfway, scraped the ground with their front hooves, and sniffed the air with that concentration animals have when instinct is working without interference. Sarah went over to the spot. She knelt, pressed her palm to the ground. The coolness was there, more noticeable than the other times, or maybe she just already knew where to look. She stayed there in silence for a moment. Then she got up, dusted off her pants with her hand, and made a decision. She needed someone to drill the ground. The problem was she had no money at all for that. Mr. Samuel Harrison was known in the area for two things: the white hair that had gone grey early, still in his 30s, and the stubbornness of only doing business on terms he himself set. He had drilled wells all over that region for decades, with equipment that looked old, but worked better than a lot of the new stuff that came later. He had a reputation for not taking work on credit, not making exceptions for anyone, and not caring about others' opinions on his decisions. Sarah found him one morning in front of the hardware store, where he bought parts for his equipment. He was loading a heavy box into the bed of his old pickup truck when she approached. "Mr. Samuel, good morning." He looked at her sideways, recognized her face. "Sarah Miller. Long time no see. I need to talk to you about a job." "Drilling?" "Drilling." He set the box down on the truck bed and turned to her with an expression that promised nothing. "You know my terms. I know, that's what I want to talk about." He listened. Sarah was direct. She told him she didn't have the money for the down payment, that it would probably take some time to gather the full amount for the service, but that she was offering to make up for it with work. She would go to his property for as long as it took, to tend the fields, look after the animals, whatever he needed. Mr. Samuel was quiet for so long that she almost repeated the offer, thinking he hadn't heard. "You're offering to work on my property in exchange for me drilling yours," he said finally, more as a statement than a question. "I am." "And why do you think there's water where you want me to drill?" she explained. She talked about her grandfather, the memory, the sheep, the behavior pattern she'd documented in the little notebook. As she spoke, she expected to see the same skeptical expression on the old man's face she'd seen on her husband's. But Mr. Samuel listened with a surprising attentiveness. When she finished, he took off his hat, ran a hand through his white hair and put the hat back on. "Your grandfather was Arthur Miller?" "Yes. I knew him. Good man. He knew how to read the land in a way few others do." Sarah stood still. "You knew about him?" "I worked around here many years ago, miss. Arthur Miller once told me during a porch conversation that he had a spot on his property he believed was good for a well. But back then, the family couldn't afford to pay for it, and later he passed away." Sarah felt something tighten in her chest. It wasn't sadness. It was something else, more like the feeling of a story that had been waiting to continue. "So you believe there might be water there?" Mr. Samuel looked at her for a long moment. "I don't know if there is. But I accept your offer." He extended his hand. "You start Tuesday on my property. I'll organize the equipment and show up at yours by the end of the week." Sarah shook his hand with a firmness he seemed to respect. She returned home with a mix of relief and anxiety that she wasn't sure where to put. She had gotten the driller. But she still had to face the fact that her husband wasn't there, that her daughters needed stability, that the whole community was waiting for her to slip up, and that the Sterlings would certainly show up when the equipment arrived. Beyond that, there was something else that worried her more than anything. What if there was no water? That question woke her up at 3 a.m. the following night. She lay in the dark with her eyes open, listening to the wind sweeping across the field outside, and for the first time since she had bought the sheep, she let the doubt linger without trying to push it away. Grandpa Arthur had found that special spot decades ago. But a child's memory is imperfect. The exact spot could be slightly off from what she remembered. The sheep could have been heading to that corner for any other reason she hadn't considered. The chill in the ground could be explained in other ways. She stayed awake with these thoughts until nearly 5 a.m. When she got up, turned on the kitchen light, opened her little notebook and reread every entry she had made. Each day, each time, each movement of the flock documented. 12 days of observation, without a single exception to the pattern. She closed the notebook, went back to bed, and finally fell asleep. On Tuesday morning, she dropped her daughters off at school and went to Mr. Harrison's property to work. His field needed urgent weeding, and there were 3 head of cattle showing signs of ticks that needed treatment. She worked all day, came home at 5 in the evening with her arms aching and her clothes soaked in sweat, and still had the energy to make dinner and help Molly with her math homework before bed. On Thursday, a message came through the neighbor's son. Mr. Harrison would be at her property on Monday morning with the equipment. Sarah read the message twice, folded the paper, put it in her pocket. That night, she called Thomas. He answered after 3 rings, with a voice that didn't reveal whether he was angry or just tired. "Hi," he said. "Hi," she replied. "The driller is coming here on Monday." Silence. "Driller for what?" "For a well. I'm going to drill in the southern corner of the property." More silence. She imagined his face on the other end of the line, the expression he made when he was trying to stay calm. "Sarah, with what money?" "I made a work arrangement with Mr. Harrison. I'm working on his field in exchange for the service." She heard him breathe. "You're working for someone else to pay for your own land?" "For the possibility of my own land." "Yes." "And you didn't think you should tell me before doing that? You weren't here to tell." That hung in the air between them for a few heavy seconds. "I'll come back this weekend," he said finally, with a voice that sounded more tired than angry. "But we need to talk, Sarah." "We do," she agreed. "I'll wait for you." She hung up the phone. She sat on the edge of the bed for a while, looking at the floor, and noticed her hands were trembling slightly. Not from fear. From relief. He was coming back. On Saturday afternoon, Thomas's car came up the dirt road to the property. Molly, who was playing outside, ran to her father before he even turned off the engine, and the sight of her throwing herself into his arms as he got out of the car loosened something inside Sarah, a knot she didn't even know she was carrying. They greeted each other with a hug that wasn't one of reconciliation yet, but one of familiarity, of 2 bodies that know each other's place, even when their minds are still struggling to accept it. Thomas put his backpack in the bedroom, sat at the kitchen table, and Sarah put coffee in his cup without needing to ask if he wanted it. "I'm not promising I agree," he said, holding the cup with both hands. "I'm not asking you to agree," she replied. "I'm asking you to stay." He looked at her. "I'm here," he said. It wasn't everything, but it was enough for now. On Monday morning, Mr. Samuel Harrison's truck came down the road with the drilling equipment. Sarah had been up since 5 with the coffee already made and the property gate open. Thomas stood at a distance, watching the equipment being positioned in the south corner of the land, with a closed expression that didn't reveal what he was thinking. In less than an hour, the Sterling couple showed up. Sarah saw them coming down the road in the white pickup truck and positioning themselves at the fence that divided the 2 properties with that familiarity of people who think they have the right to observe what happens on the other side. Howard stood still, with his arms crossed over the railing, and Eleanor beside him with an expression that mixed curiosity and contempt in equal parts. "You folks ever find any water around here?" Howard called out loudly, clearly so the workers could hear. No one answered. "Because this soil is dry to the core, everyone around here knows that," he continued, unable to hide the smug anticipation of someone who already feels like a winner. Sarah turned her back to him and went to follow the start of the drilling. Mr. Samuel Harrison's equipment was noisy, and the engine's vibration shook the ground in the surrounding area in rhythmic waves. The sheep, which were loose in the field, backed away from the noise and moved farther off. Sarah noticed that, even spooked by the machinery, most of them stayed clustered at the edge of the field closest to the south corner, as if they didn't want to stray too far from that spot. The first few feet of drilling brought exactly what Howard had predicted loudly from across the fence: red, hard earth and dry rock. The workers hired by Mr. Samuel Harrison worked without comment, but Sarah caught the glances exchanged between them. Thomas approached her at the end of the afternoon, when the machinery had stopped for adjustments and the workers were resting. "Still nothing," he said quietly. "It's the first day," she replied. "How long did Samuel say it would take?" "He didn't say. Could be days." Thomas was silent for a moment, looking at the hole that had started to appear in the south corner of the property. "And if there's nothing there, Sarah?" he asked, his voice no longer angry but filled with genuine concern. "What do we do?" She took a moment to answer. "If there's nothing there, we'll face it the same way we've faced everything that came before, together." She paused. "But there will be." He didn't say anything, but he stayed by her side until the sun began to dip below the horizon, and that, at that moment, was more than she needed. At the end of the afternoon, Howard and Eleanor left satisfied. Howard's expression as he left was that of someone who had already gotten what he came for, confirmation that the soil had yielded nothing on the first day. But what Howard didn't know, and what Sarah had noticed early in the afternoon, was that one of the workers had slipped in a spot on the ground near the drilling point. It hadn't rained in weeks. The sun had beat down hard all day. There was no reason for the ground to be damp there, unless there was one. Sarah didn't say anything. She kept it to herself and went to prepare dinner with the girls. That night, for the first time in many weeks, she slept deeply and didn't wake up in the middle of the night. On the second day of drilling, Mr. Samuel Harrison arrived earlier than the workers and paced around the spot before starting the equipment. Sarah accompanied him in silence. The old man examined the ground with an attention she recognized, the same her grandpa Arthur had when he walked the property. "Yesterday, one of the guys slipped here," said Sarah. Mr. Samuel Harrison stopped. He crouched down. He examined the soil at that spot for a long moment, running his hand through the dirt in a way that seemed more like assessment than habit. "Where exactly?" She pointed to the spot. He stood there for a few more minutes. Then he got up, took off his hat and put it back on. "Move the drilling point 2 meters east," he told the workers who were arriving, "and go deeper than we did yesterday." That second day was slower. The equipment worked for hours at a pace that alternated between progress and stops for adjustment. Thomas lingered nearby during the morning, then went to handle other tasks on the property, but Sarah noticed he kept coming back every hour to check on things. Emily came home from school and went straight to the field, where she stood beside her mother, watching with a curiosity that was half her mother's and half her own adolescence. "Mum, do you really think there's water here?" "I do." "How do you know?" Sarah looked at her daughter. "You remember how I sometimes tell you stories about great-grandpa Arthur? The one with the straw hat. That's him. He taught me to read the land when I was very little. It took me a long time to understand what he was teaching me, but I never forgot." Emily was quiet for a moment, looking at the hole the equipment was deepening. "And the sheep. Did you buy them because of that?" Sarah smiled at her daughter. "Your great-grandfather also taught me that animals know what people don't see. I needed animals that ran on pure instinct, without any formed habits, animals that would look for water before learning to live here." Emily was silent for a moment. Then, "So that's why everyone buys fat sheep and you bought the skinny ones?" "Exactly." The girl looked at her mother with an expression Sarah couldn't immediately identify. Then she understood. It was pride, mixed with surprise, but pride. That night, when the house lights were off and Thomas was lying beside her in the dark, he said in a low voice, "Emily told me about Grandpa Arthur." Sarah didn't answer right away. "She explained the whole logic to me better than you did," he continued. "She talked about the sheep, the instinct, the cold spot in the soil." "She's smart," said Sarah. "Takes after her mother," he replied. The silence that followed was different from the silences of the past few weeks. It was a silence for two. On the morning of the third day, Mr. Samuel Harrison arrived before everyone else, just as he had on the second day, and Sarah was there when he showed up, with 2 cups of coffee she had brought from the kitchen. They stood drinking the coffee without talking, staring at the equipment at the southern edge of the property, and there was something in that shared silence that felt like the prelude to something. When the workers arrived and the equipment was turned on, something in the behavior of the sheep caught Sarah's attention. On the other days, the animals had backed away from the engine noise, moving farther out into the field. But on that third day, instead of retreating, they began to approach. Not fast, not dramatically, but in small movements that kept shortening the distance between them and the drilling point, as if they were waiting for something. Sarah watched the flock with her heart racing. Thomas came to her side at 9 in the morning and stayed there, needing no explanation to remain. At noon, something changed in the sound of the equipment. It was a small difference, a slight shift in the vibration's rhythm, but Mr. Samuel Harrison heard it before anyone else. He raised his hand. Stop. The equipment shut off. The sudden silence after hours of noise was almost physical. The old man went down next to the drilling point, crouched, examined the dirt that had come out through the drill bit. He was silent for a long moment. Then he stood up and said, with a calm that clashed with the situation, "Turn it back on, and push it deeper." The workers exchanged a glance, but they obeyed. Sarah Miller stood right where she was, unable to move. The sheep gathered around the well were completely still. Even the most restless animals in the herd stood motionless, as if they knew it was time to wait. Thomas was beside her. She felt his hand find hers without either of them having planned it. When the water rose, it rose slowly, first as a dampness that appeared on the walls of the borehole, then as a movement that Mr. Samuel Harrison saw before the others, and that made him take a step back. Then it came with force. The jet that shot up through the drill pushed dirt, and then came clean, clear, strong, with a pressure that made the workers step back and soaked the surrounding ground in seconds. The sound of water meeting air after being trapped underground for too long was a sound Sarah had never heard before, but recognized in a way that had no rational explanation. Mr. Samuel Harrison stood in front of the jet for a few seconds. Then he slowly took off his hat, ran a hand through his white hair, and shook his head with an expression that someone who had known him for a long time would have recognized as rare. "In 40 years, he said, to no one in particular, I've come across this only a few times. A wide aquifer, clean, at a depth the other wells in the region never reached. The water reached Sarah's feet, soaking her boots with mud, and she felt the tears before she realized they were coming. They weren't tears of relief, they weren't tears of victory. They were the tears of someone who had carried something alone for too long and could finally set it down. Thomas was looking at her. She turned to him with her face wet and water at her feet, and he said nothing, just opened his arms and she went to him. They stayed like that for an indefinite time, while the workers celebrated around them and the sheep approached the water springing from the earth as if they had been waiting for it all along. Emily came home from school that afternoon and found the scene. The south corner of the field flooded. Her mother in muddy boots with a smile she had never seen before. Her father beside her with the look of someone who had just understood something important, and Mr. Samuel Harrison talking to the workers with his hat in his hands. She stopped at the entrance to the field. She looked at everything. Then she ran. She hugged her mother hard enough to throw her off balance, and Sarah laughed, an open, loud laugh that hadn't come out of her like that in months. "You were right," Emily whispered in her mother's ear. "Your great-grandfather was right," Sarah corrected. "I just listened." The news spread through the little town of Hope Junction that afternoon. With the speed of things, people can't hold back. By the time the sun was going down, there were already 4 pickup trucks parked on the side of the road, with people looking at Sarah's property, with expressions ranging from disbelief to admiration. The same ranchers who had laughed at the livestock auction now stood silent on the road, not quite knowing what to say. Howard Sterling showed up before nightfall with Eleanor beside him, this time through the main gate, not the fence. His face had changed entirely since the morning. There was no longer that smug anticipation of someone waiting for another to fail. In its place was something that, on any other face, Sarah would have called discomfort. "Sarah," he began, with a voice that had lost its usual gruffness, "we need to talk about how this is going to work from here on out. About water rights, you know. About what would be fair between neighbors." Sarah listened to him from start to finish, without interrupting him once. She let him finish. Then she was silent for a moment. "I'll need a few days to think," she said. He nodded, trying to keep a reasonable tone. Sure. We'll talk calmly. We've been neighbors for a long time, after all." Sarah didn't answer that. He just nodded and headed toward the house, leaving the couple standing in the middle of the property. Thomas found her in the kitchen as she was fixing dinner. "Howard left," he said. "I saw," she replied. "What are you going to tell him?" Sarah rested the spoon on the edge of the pot and turned to face her husband. "I called Mr. Clifford, and 3 other small ranchers from around here to come first thing tomorrow morning, the ones who are suffering the most from the drought. Thomas looked at her for a moment. And Howard? Howard has a big property. He has reserves. He has contacts outside. He doesn't need the water. He wants it because it's mine, not because he needs it. Thomas was quiet for a moment. And what's the proposal you're going to make to the others? Sharing. A collaboration deal. They help with the work here. I guarantee access to the water. Simple. He stared at her. You were already thinking about this before you found the water. I was thinking about it when I bought the sheep. Thomas stepped away from the window and walked over to her. He stood in front of his wife with an expression she recognized from years ago, from their early days together, when he still looked at her with that mix of admiration and being disarmed that she thought time had erased. I was wrong, he said quietly, when I left. You were scared, she said. That's different. I should have stayed. But you came back. She placed her hand on his arm. That's what matters. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot. We're just getting started. Now, continuing. The next morning, 4 pickup trucks from the small ranchers in the area arrived early at Sarah's property. Mr. Clifford Jenkins was the oldest among them, a 68-year-old man whose hands told the story of someone who had worked the land their whole life and who had lost almost all his cattle in the last drought because he couldn't afford feed for all of them. He arrived with his hat in his hand and the look of someone not used to needing a favor. Sarah welcomed him with coffee on the porch and spoke without preamble. Mr. Clifford, what I have here isn't enough just for me, and it wouldn't be fair to keep it to myself while others are suffering. The old man studied her carefully. And what do you want in return? Work, not money. When I need hands here, you come. When you need hands there, we go. We'll divide the water according to each person's need. Mr. Clifford was silent for a moment, looking at the coffee cup in his hands. Was that something your grandfather taught you? He asked at last. Sarah was surprised. How did you know about my grandfather? Arthur Miller taught me how to hoe the right way when I was 12. He was a neighbor of my mother's family. The old man smiled from one corner of his mouth. He was the kind of man who shared what he had without anyone having to ask. Sarah felt a warmth in her chest. So do you accept? I accept. He extended his hand. And I can speak for the others here too. The other 3 ranchers nodded. The deal was made right there on the porch, with no paper, no signature, no middleman. Just a word given among people who knew its weight. Howard Sterling found out about the deal that same afternoon. He showed up at the property just before dinner, this time with the middleman who had delivered the purchase proposal weeks earlier, as if having a witness would change anything. Sarah, I think you're being impulsive, he said, in that tone of someone pretending to think out loud for the other person's good. The right thing would be to sit down, talk it over, handle this in an organized way with someone who understands business. It's already organized, she replied. Howard blinked. What do you mean? The deal is already done, with the ranchers who need it. He stood still for a moment, processing. And me? Sarah looked at him calmly. You've always had the means to drill your own well, Howard. You know it. The silence that followed was the kind that says everything without a word. Howard looked at her, then at the middleman beside him, then back at her. And for the first time since Sarah could remember, he didn't have a ready answer. He left without saying another word. The middleman followed. Eleanor, who had stayed in the pickup truck, looked out the window as her husband got into the vehicle. For a moment, she and Sarah met eyes through the glass. Sarah didn't smile, didn't wave. She just held her gaze until the truck backed up and drove off down the dirt road, kicking up dust. Thomas, who had been watching the scene from the porch entrance, came over to his wife when the truck disappeared around the bend. It's over, he said. It'll never truly be over, she replied. But now it's different. He nodded in agreement. The weeks that followed were hard work, but a different kind of work. The well had to be properly structured to handle shared use, which required materials and labor that the partners in the agreement contributed little by little. Mr. Clifford showed up almost every day with a son or son-in-law to help, and there was something about that collective movement that breathed back into the property a life it had lost during the harshest months of the drought. The pasture that was irrigated with water from the well began to respond within 2 weeks. It wasn't an instant miracle. It was the slow, stubborn green of something that had been waiting for the chance. Sarah watched its growth almost daily, walking through the field early in the morning with her hand brushing the tips of the new grass pushing out of the parched earth. The sheep were the first to show a visible difference. With fresh pasture and clean water available, the animals that had arrived skeletal gained volume week after week. Their wool grew thicker. Their posture changed, that weakness in the front legs gradually disappearing as their health returned. And when the first batch of lambs was born, Mr. Samuel came back to the property just to see, as he had said he would. He stood still, looking at the flock for a long time. "Your grandpa would have liked to see this," he said to Sarah, who was beside him. "I know," she replied. The old man picked up his hat, adjusted it on his head. "I found good water in 40 years, young lady. But no one ever asked me with the argument you used." He shook his head. "A skinny sheep as a research tool. Arthur Miller was truly something special." He left after that, and Sarah stayed alone with the flock for a while, crouching among the animals with her boots in the mud that the water had created around the new trough, and felt that open smile Emily had described to her school friends with words that reached Sarah by chance. "My mom has a smile when she's in the middle of the sheep that looks like the sun came out of her." It wasn't an exaggeration. There was a specific day, maybe 2 months after the discovery, that Sarah stored in her memory more vividly than all the others. It was a weekend afternoon, the sun setting with that color that makes the field look like it's made of gold, and Thomas was fixing the old gate he'd promised to repair for months. Emily was sitting on the porch reading a school book. Molly was running with the dog across the field, and Sarah was crouching among the sheep, stroking the thick wool of one that had arrived the most fragile, feeling the solidity of the animal that had recovered. She heard a pickup truck pass on the dirt road. She looked up instinctively. It was Howard and Eleanor passing by her property on their way back to theirs. The truck slowed down as it passed by the entrance, and Sarah saw the two of them looking at the field, at the green pasture, at the fat sheep, at the property that had transformed. Howard didn't stop. Eleanor looked away, and in that look away was all the recognition Sarah had never expected to receive from them. There were no words, no gesture, no admission of anything. Just the gaze that fled from her field in haste, like someone touching something that burns. It was worth more than anything they could have said. A few months later, when winter brought the first rains the region had anxiously awaited for 2 years, Sarah's property was the only one that didn't urgently need them. The well had sustained the pasture and the animals through the driest period, and when the rain came it was like reinforcement on a foundation that was already solid. The flock that had arrived skeletal began to become a reason for visits. Not from people she knew, but from ranchers, from farther-off properties, who had heard the story and came to see for themselves. One man from a property nearly 30 kilometers away arrived one afternoon with his teenage son and stood by the corral fence for almost half an hour, watching the sheep without saying a word. When he left, he only said that he had bought bad animals in the past without knowing what to do with them, and that maybe he had thrown away an opportunity without understanding it. Sarah didn't elaborate further with him, but when he left, she realized that the story of the 90 sheep had become something bigger than her property. It had become an example of the kind that circulates among people who work the land, that sort of story that starts with everyone laughing and ends with everyone thinking about what it means to have the courage to do things differently. There was also the matter of Mrs. Beatrice. Beatrice Thorne was the oldest woman in the community, 71 years old, who lived in a small house with old tile roofing 4 properties down from Sarah's, alone since her husband had passed away too soon. She no longer raised animals, no longer planted anything, lived on a small pension, and occasionally received a visit from a niece who lived in the nearby town, but didn't show up as often as the local gossip mill insisted on exaggerating. Mrs. Beatrice had gone to the market the day after the discovery of the water, and since the little town's market was the place where news circulated even before it was confirmed, she found out everything before she got home. But unlike everyone else who had been surprised or embarrassed for having doubted, Mrs. Beatrice just shook her head with that calm of someone who hasn't been surprised by anything for a long time. "Arthur Miller," she said to the market owner without any further context. The market owner blinked. "What do you mean, Mrs. Beatrice?" "Arthur Miller's granddaughter found water. It's no coincidence. It's not luck. It's in the blood." She adjusted her bag on her arm and left as if the matter was settled. When Sarah heard this story 2 days later, through Emily, who had heard it from a co-worker, who had heard it from a mother who had been at the market, she stood in the kitchen for a long moment, unable to define what she was feeling. She went to the porch. She stood looking at the field. Then she took the old car and drove to Mrs. Beatrice's house. The old woman was sitting in the rocking chair on the porch when Sarah arrived, as if she were waiting, even though she couldn't have known she would come. Her hair was in a white bun, her hands in her lap, her eyes still alive and sharp despite the years. "Sarah Miller," she said without surprise. "Sit down." Sarah sat in the wooden chair next to the old woman. For a moment they were both silent, looking at the dirt road that ran past the house. "Did you know my grandfather?" Sarah asked. "I knew your grandfather. I knew your father. I knew you when you still wore pigtails." Mrs. Beatrice Thorne looked at her sideways. "There are people in our lives we don't remember, but who helped shape who we are. Your grandfather was like that for a lot of folks around here. You know what happened." "Everyone knows, girl." The old woman rocked slowly in her chair. "But most folks know about the water. They don't understand the story." Sarah was silent, waiting. "The story," Mrs. Beatrice continued, with that rhythm of someone who had told many stories in her life, "isn't that you found water. The story is that you listened to what everyone chose not to hear for 50 years. My grandfather tried to teach me to read the land. Your grandfather tried to teach a lot of people." The old woman paused. "But people think old folks' wisdom is just nostalgia, that what worked before doesn't work anymore." She shook her head slightly, "and so they go looking for what's right under their feet in the middle of nowhere." Sarah sat with those words for a moment. "Did you hear it too, Mrs. Beatrice?" The old woman smiled out of one corner of her mouth. "I heard it, but I didn't have the courage you did. I always had too much to lose, and I thought that was reason enough not to take a risk." She stopped rocking for a moment. It wasn't. They fell back into silence. The afternoon was quiet in that part of the community, the warm wind moving the branches of the big tree in front of Mrs. Beatrice's house. "Did you know Howard tried to talk to Samuel?" the old woman asked suddenly. Sarah turned to her. "I didn't. It was 2 days after you closed the deal with the breeders. Howard went to Samuel to ask if he'd be up for drilling on his property too." Mrs. Beatrice looked at her. "Samuel said his schedule was full indefinitely." Sarah was quiet. "Beto has never had a full schedule in his life," said Mrs. Beatrice, and there was a subtle humor in her voice that Sarah recognized as the humor of someone who had lived long enough to find amusement in justice when it comes at the right time. Sarah left Mrs. Beatrice's house with something different from what she had brought, not new information, but a perspective that reorganized things she already knew. Her grandfather had left an inheritance that wasn't on any paper, wasn't registered at any notary, didn't have a value anyone could put in a purchase offer. It was in the people he had touched throughout his life, in the stories that remained, in the porch conversations that seemed irrelevant at the time but eventually made sense. She went home thinking about that. Thomas was in the corral when she arrived, tending to the animals with a dedication that had come back in full force over the last few weeks. He had rediscovered himself in the work on the property since the turnaround, as if the discovery of water had unlocked something in him too, a belief he had lost along with the reserve and the pride. "You disappeared," he said, without stopping what he was doing. "I went to visit Mrs. Beatrice." "Ah." He looked at her. "She's a good person." "She is." Sarah leaned against the corral fence. "Did you know she knew my grandfather?" "Everyone of a certain age around here knew your grandfather, Sarah." He tossed the hay into the feeder. "Your grandfather was the kind of person you don't forget." Sarah stood looking at the herd, moving in the corral with that vitality she still hadn't gotten used to seeing in them after the way they had arrived. Thomas. Did you really forgive me? He stopped what he was doing, turned to face her. Forgive what? For using everything without telling you. He looked at her for a moment. I had to go to Stephen's house, he said, speaking of his brother, to understand something. I stayed there for 3 days, thinking I was mad at you about the money. And then I realized it wasn't the money. What was it? It was feeling left out of a decision that was ours. He walked up to the fence where she was standing and stayed on the other side. But later I kept thinking about what you would have done if you'd told me before buying. You would have said no. I would have said no in 2 seconds. He nodded. And you knew that. I knew. So what you did wasn't shutting me out. It was protecting something you believed in without being able to prove it yet. He was silent for a moment. It doesn't make me happy to have been left out, but I understand. And no, I'm not angry. Sarah looked at him. But next time, he said, tell me first. Even if I say no, at least say it. Deal. He went back to work. She stayed leaning on the fence for a while longer, looking at the herd, and thought that there are things in a marriage that don't get fixed all at once, but that truly get mended when you give them time. That week, a small thing happened that Sarah hadn't expected, and that somehow became one of the most lasting. The school where Emily and Molly studied put on a presentation in the community hall, where each student was supposed to talk about something they had learned at home. Molly, who was 11 and had the spontaneity that Thomas always said she got from her mother when she was young, chose to talk about the sheep. Sarah and Thomas went to the presentation together. They sat in the white plastic chairs that the school always set out for these occasions, in a hall that smelled like pine and was nearly full of parents and grandparents. When it was Molly's turn, the girl climbed onto the small makeshift stage with a confidence that made Sarah sink into her chair. My mum bought 90 skinny sheep, Molly began in a clear voice. Everyone laughed. My dad was angry. But my mum didn't back down. There was a silence in the hall. Because my mum heard something her great-grandfather said when she was a kid, and she never forgot. Molly paused. The lesson I learned at home is that sometimes the smartest person in the room isn't the one who talks the loudest. It's the one who stays quiet and listens to what most people aren't paying attention to. Sarah felt Thomas's hand find hers in the space between the chairs. There were no tears. There was something different, something firmer, more lasting than a tear. It was the recognition that some things are worth the price they ask, and you only know that when you make it to the other side of them. After the presentation, several people came to talk to her, some with genuine admiration, others still with that discomfort of those who don't know how to act around someone who proved they were wrong. Sarah received them all with the same calm, without keeping score, without reminding anyone who had laughed in the livestock auction shed. There was a middle-aged woman who approached with her young daughters beside her and said in a low voice, "Sarah, I was one of the ones who said you had lost your mind that day at the auction. I want to apologize." Sarah looked at her. "I would understand if I were in your shoes," she said. "It really did look crazy. But it wasn't. It wasn't. But there was no way to prove it beforehand, and sometimes people need time to understand that not proving something ahead of time doesn't mean it's not right." The woman nodded, hugged her daughters who were tugging at her, and left. And Sarah thought that maybe that was the only kind of reconciliation worth anything. Not the apology itself, but the willingness to say out loud what you had done wrong, without expecting anyone to ask. Mr. Clifford was the first to say, one afternoon when the breeders from the agreement gathered on Sarah's porch to talk about the next season, "Sarah, I'm going to say something I should have said before. When you bought those sheep at the auction, I was there, and I made light of it too." She looked at him. "But you didn't laugh out loud," she said. "No, but I thought it. That's all right, Mr. Clifford. It's not all right, because you did exactly what your grandpa would have done. And I should have recognized that." There was a brief, comfortable silence between them. "Arthur Miller," the old man continued, "always said that the land has an answer for those who have the patience to listen. Most of us stopped listening. You didn't." Sarah was silent for a moment. "Sometimes I almost stopped too," she said. Mr. Clifford nodded as if that were truer than anything she could have said. Emily, who had overheard the conversation from the kitchen doorway, went to her room afterward and wrote in her own notebook, in the same small, steady handwriting as her mother's, the words the old man had spoken. "The land has an answer for those who have the patience to listen." She didn't yet know what she would do with that phrase, but she knew she would need it someday. Thomas, that night as they turned off the bedroom light, said in a low voice that didn't require a reply, "You're the bravest person I've ever met." Sarah was silent for a moment. "It was Grandpa," she said, just as she had told Emily months before. "No," he replied. "He taught you to listen. But listening isn't easy either. How many people heard him and forgot?" "You didn't forget." She sat with that for a long time after he fell asleep. She hadn't forgotten. That was exactly it. It hadn't been brilliance. It hadn't been luck in the empty sense of the word. It hadn't been magical intuition. It had been the decision, made and remade every day of doubt, not to let the memory die. Not to let the opinion of a crowded barn erase what a barefoot grandfather in the mud had planted in her decades before. It had cost the family's savings, her husband's trust for a time, the judgment of the entire community. It had cost weeks of working on other people's land to pay for a service she couldn't afford herself. It had cost sleepless nights, with doubt visiting every corner of her mind. But it had been worth it. And there on that property where the pasture was now green even in the winter that had been slow to come, where 90 sheep that had arrived without strength chewed contentedly in the pen she had fixed with her own hands, where her daughters came home from school without hearing hallway whispers anymore, where her husband had returned with something steadier in his eyes than before he left, where the neighbors in need drank the water she had decided not to keep only for herself, Sarah Miller understood that some gambles aren't gambles at all. They are inheritances waiting to be claimed. Months later, on a golden late afternoon that painted the field, orange and ochre, Sarah went to the southern corner of the property alone. She stood still at the same spot where her grandfather had stood decades before, her feet on ground that was now damp in a permanent way, and she was silent for a long moment. She didn't say anything out loud. There was nothing to say that the sheep drinking around her, the green pasture growing where there had once been dust, and the sound of water running in the improvised channel weren't already saying for her. But she thought of Grandpa Arthur, of the bare foot in the mud, of the serious voice of someone who has discovered something precious, of the look he had cast upon the little braided girl who followed him on that drizzly afternoon, as if he knew he was entrusting something important to the right person. She had been the right person, not because she was smarter than the others, not because she had been luckier, but because she had chosen, every day of doubt and every night of fear, to keep listening. And listening, as Mrs. Beatrice had said, is no small thing. End of story. Tell us what you thought of this story and where you're watching us from. Do you think Sarah made the right choice by trusting her grandfather's memory? Leave your opinion in the comments, your like, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories.